Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our research seminar this week, featuring our own Ellie Sheild in her work with David Luberoff, Accessory Dwelling Units, Lessons from Around the Country. Before I turn to today's presentation, I want to give a shout out or a promo for our other upcoming seminars. We are entering our busy season, so next Friday, we have a seminar by Sean Lee, a Meyer Fellow at the Joint Center, on can mortgage forbearance help stabilize the economy. The following Friday, we will then have an event featuring Ho-Jung Lee, Assistant Professor at Seoul National University and former postdoctoral fellow of the Joint Center, on the Move, our millennials leading a back to the city movement or moving to the suburbs. And then the following week, we'll have a hybrid event, which will be partially available online and partially available in person at the Kennedy School on homelessness is a housing problem, featuring Greg Colburn of the University of Washington, and we'll have commentary from Linda Downey of the Pine Street Inn. So we're looking forward to all three of those events. I hope to see you there. You can find out more information on our website and register there for them as well. So let me turn to our seminar today. Very excited to have Ellie Sheild, who is a Joint Center research assistant, has been a student at the Graduate School of Design and Urban Planning and now real estate, and has been the lead author on this project on ADUs with her co-author, David Luberoff. The paper will be forthcoming in the next week or two, so stay tuned to our website for the actual paper that Ellie will be presenting today. Following Ellie's presentation, we'll then have a conversation including Jesse Kanson-Benanav of Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. So we should have an interesting conversation about ADUs and the potential for them to make greater inroads or be used more to a greater extent in Massachusetts. So with that, let me turn it over to Ellie for her presentation today. Ellie, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. As Chris mentioned, my name is Ellie Sheild. I recently graduated from Harvard with a Master in Urban Planning degree, and I'm now working on a Master in Real Estate degree. For the past 2 or so years, I've had the pleasure of being a research assistant at the Joint Center, working with the Deputy Director, David Luberoff. With funding from the Simone Foundation, we've been examining state and local initiatives related to accessory dwelling units. Today, I'll be describing our work, which will soon be published as a Joint Center working paper. A special thanks to Matt McDonald from the Foundation for his interest and support for this work, as well as the many people interviewed for this project. Our research started from the observation of a general growing interest in small infill housing units known as accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, as a useful tool to address housing challenges. A growing number of local and a handful of state laws have made it easier to build ADUs. Several other states, including Massachusetts, are considering this. So, what might Massachusetts and other states learn from places that have recently adopted ADU-related laws and regulations? To answer this question, we conducted a literature review on the topic, interviewed a variety of experts, and explored 2 in-depth case studies: the city of Portland, Oregon, and the state of New Hampshire. I'll begin with the background on ADUs, their benefits and hurdles, and provide an overview of our 2 case studies, which can inform policy implications for states like Massachusetts. I'll then highlight key strategic questions and offer concluding thoughts. To briefly highlight our conclusions, if places want to build ADUs, they must first have policy, preferably at the state level, that requires by right approvals. Second, limiting localities' ability to impose requirements for owner occupancy and parking is important, but not quite as critical. Third, changing policies in these areas can help others break the cycle of ADU barriers, namely a lack of homeowner education, financing, and ADU specialized builders. While accessory dwelling units go by a variety of names, we define them as small, independent living units that are within, attached to, or detached, but on the same parcel as the primary residence. Their key distinction is that they must be subordinate to and functionally independent from the main house. ADUs have over a century of history in our housing landscape and predate early zoning, beginning as ancillary buildings or carriage houses for workers on large farm estates or urban mansions. ADUs were more prohibited in the middle of the century as use-based Euclidean zoning and its preference for low-density, large lot housing spread across the country. However, the 1980s, as a part of a new urbanism movement and its focus on small infill housing, prompted renewed interest in ADUs and some action by more localities and a small number of states. Such interest carried into the 21st century, and the AARP published its first model, ADU model, for state acts and local ordinances in 2000. Substantial changes in state laws remained relatively rare until the mid-2010s. Most recently, many localities and states are considering code updates, and ADUs have become a part of the national dialogue on housing affordability. The paper categorizes 4 areas of appeal for ADU development for occupants, homeowners, and cities: economic, environmental, social, and health. By increasing supply, they can make housing more affordable. By providing affordable units in currently expensive locations and by providing additional rental income, ADUs can help offset a homeowner's housing costs and can expand economic opportunities that would advance a city's housing goals. By housing occupants who use less energy for both heating and transportation by car, and offering new housing within or along a city's existing infrastructure, ADUs can provide significant environmental benefits. By creating distinct living quarters that remain connected to existing homes, they can foster multi-generational living that expands health and social well-being. And because of their flexible designs, ADUs can house many different types of people and have many uses across their lifespan. So why don't we build more of them? Zoning is both the main pathway for ADU development and a main hurdle. Generally, we know homeowners are concerned over any changes in their neighborhood, particularly given that their houses are often their largest single financial asset. Local zoning is driven in large measure by concerns of existing homeowners who tend to be opposed to neighboring ADUs. Firstly, localities' main tool for hindering ADU development is requiring the proposed ADUs be approved via special or conditional use permits. Such permits are often issued at the discretion of a public body, which often listens to opposed homeowners. This first tool is the opposite of by right permits, where city staff administratively reviews requests based on objective standards set forth in advance. Some localities require that an owner must live in the primary residence or the new ADU, or even go further to require the ADU only be occupied by a relative or caregiver, both of which, our research finds, are provisions seemingly unique to ADUs. Owner occupancy supporters argue that this deters speculative development and resident owners are more likely to take good care of their properties. Opponents of this claim that the high cost per square foot to build ADUs dissuades investors, and more often than not, homeowners still live on the property regardless of any requirement to do so. Illustratively, 70 to 90% of ADUs in Portland, which does not have an owner occupancy requirement, are still built by homeowner developers, and almost 2/3 of the owners live on site. Finally, while many localities must allow ADUs, they frequently require that they include off-street parking, making it cost prohibitive. For example, in New Hampshire, where the state law does not limit the number of parking spaces that localities can require, 2 or more spaces are required on 42% of the land where ADUs are allowed, according to a recently launched New Hampshire zoning atlas. Taken together, our research discusses how these obstacles can create a self-reinforcing cycle of barriers. Notably, when few ADUs exist, Only a handful of homeowners will know about the opportunities they present and therefore do not try to build them, especially if they've heard that the approval process can be cumbersome and unpredictable. Second, if few ADUs are built, then there may be a dearth of opportunities to finance new ones, particularly for moderate income homeowners or homeowners without significant equity in their homes or access to other funds. For instance, in 2021, researchers surveyed about 800 California homeowners who added an ADU. They found that 62% used personal savings to finance some or all of the costs of the project, and 43% sourced funds from some sort of mortgage on their primary property. Thirdly, if few ADUs are being built, only a handful of builders and designers will have the skills needed to overcome the spatial challenges of building a unit inside of or on the same parcel as existing and usually occupied homes. So what's been changing? There are countervailing forces. In recent decades, some localities have made it easier to build ADUs. More recently, many states have adopted laws establishing frameworks for local regulation. As the chart shows, states have taken different paths, particularly with respect to by right permitting, owner occupancy, and parking requirements. The chart highlights that some of the earliest and most ambitious state legislation has occurred on the West Coast. Decades ago, California and Washington both passed laws that did not mandate local approval. The really significant action on the West Coast starts with California in 2016, Oregon in 2017, and more recently with Washington and Montana in 2023. All four of these states mandate by right approvals, ban owner occupancy requirements, two ban parking minimums outright, and the others ban parking requirements near transit. Interestingly, to the below half of the chart, the other part of the country where there's been a lot of action is New England. As you can see from the chart, with the exception of Vermont, New England states do not require by right permitting. Connecticut does, but it also allows localities to opt out of the state's ADU law. About 2/3 of the state's 169 localities have taken advantage of that provision. The result is a hodgepodge of local approaches, many restrictive. Several other states, including Massachusetts, have considered but not adopted meaningful statewide legislation. This chart illustrates the striking impacts of the state's expansive ADU laws from 2016 and 2019 on the number of ADU permits and as a percentage of all units. The blue area shows the ADU growth. For example, before 2016 legislation passed in California, localities issued around 1,200 ADU permits annually. However, in 2022, nearly 25,000 ADU permits were issued statewide, with a large majority in Los Angeles. This jump makes ADUs go from 1% to roughly 18% of new housing stock added in just 6 years, with our quick back of the envelope calculation. To better understand what places like Massachusetts can learn from the ADU frameworks in other places, we explored efforts in the city of Portland, Oregon, and the state of New Hampshire, with the idea to understand how local and state level examples can inform ADU work in states like ours. Portland, while an interesting example on its own, has also become a model not only to other cities, but many states considering ADU legislation. As a gold standard, Portland is an early and local case that shows not only how the city has fostered an ADU ecosystem, marked not only by right approvals, but removing other barriers and spurring non-zoning reform. While ADUs make up roughly 1.5% of the total housing stock, we estimate that they comprise about 15% of all new housing units built since 2010. To provide some legislative history, the city first allowed ADUs in the early 1980s, and notably in 1998, the city dropped occupancy restrictions and allowed for detached ADUs. ADU permits started to increase slowly, but an important incentive was when the city waived impact fees in 2010, which at that time saved homeowners between $7,000 to $12,000 in permit costs. Another notable change was in 2015, when the city modified its special permit and variance provisions to streamline by right review. By 2016, annual ADU permits increased to almost 500 a year for several years. More recently, the city allowed 2 ADUs per lot and loosened the size and setback restrictions, and permits have leveled off between 200 to 300 per year. People in Portland report that this is partially due to the state law that has made it easier to build small multifamily housing on sites previously restricted to single-family use. Importantly, the city's routine assessments and revisions of ADU laws has also spurred advocacy initiatives, expansion of financial products, and builders specialized in ADU production. The key takeaway from Portland is that the by right approval system, Portland also demonstrates the importance of eliminating other zoning barriers. This streamlined regulatory environment has helped spur an ecosystem of support and activity that works in conjunction with legislative updates. For example, some regional banks allow for moderate income homeowners without significant equity to more easily finance ADUs by offering loans that take into account future rental income generated from the ADU. Portland's successful ecosystem has positively influenced statewide changes in Oregon and has become a model for other places and states considering changes. As you may recall from that table, the second case study, the state of New Hampshire, is characterized by a more discretionary but early example of a state-level approach. It is similar to approaches used in other New England states and has a long enough history to see the effects on localities. So some key features from New Hampshire's approach. While it is a detailed law, it leaves high levels of discretion to localities for many important provisions. Firstly, localities must allow attached ADUs, but can do so via special permits and prohibit detached ADUs. Localities can impose stringent occupancy and parking requirements, and one unique and limiting provision is that localities must require the ADU have an interior door connecting to the main house, which is seen in the photos included. So key takeaways from New Hampshire are that the results across the state are modest and uneven. And we can illustrate this by looking at 3 large cities, large by New Hampshire standards, that have taken somewhat different approaches. The chart demonstrates that New Hampshire's largest city, Manchester, was very restrictive until just this year and adopted the bare minimum by state law. As such, Manchester has only issued 24 permits in 5 years since the law went into effect. Portsmouth, a tourist coastal city, has had some action with conditional use permits, but its ordinance predates the state law, and they're currently considering substantial revisions. And of the 3, Dover has had some of the largest number of ADU permits in the state and is different from many others by allowing ADUs by right. However, Dover's 8% of permit share is half that of Portland's 15% and less than half of California's 18%. New Hampshire is currently considering updates that would eliminate many of the barriers identified in this research. Recall, our research question was, what can a place like Massachusetts learn from the experiences of other places? Before turning to this question, I'd like to give a quick overview of where Massachusetts is now. As we know, the state law provides minimal guidance on ADUs, but there is growing momentum and interest in whether and how the state might alter its approaches. 3 ADU bills were proposed in the previous legislative session, with one coming really close. This year, a most robust ADU proposal within a more comprehensive housing bill is being pushed for by several housing-focused entities. In terms of localities, in the absence of strong guidelines, there is significant local discretion and control over ADUs. Each of Massachusetts' 351 jurisdictions have a unique set of ADU laws. The most recent survey on this is done by Amy Dane in 2018. Of 100 localities around the city of Boston, only 68 had some form of zoning for ADUs. 31 restricted their occupancy to family members or caregivers. 14 restricted ADUs to older, larger houses. Only 16 allowed for detached ADUs. And 7 places capped the number of ADU permits, either in total and or annually. But our research found a growing number of greater Boston localities like Salem, Wellesley, Newton, and Arlington that have all recently adopted some form of by right permitting. Salem has taken a particularly interesting approach, offering by right approval for affordable ADUs, which also receive a full property tax abatement. Action has also been occurring across the state. Some of those changes have been facilitated by a 2021 state law that changed the threshold of local zoning changes from a 2/3 to simple majority vote by the local governing body. For example, Barnstable made recent amendments to by right permitting and offers no interest loans to homeowners that commit to affordability restrictions on their ADU. The town has issued 60 such loans since 2021. But many others, like Lowell, have made efforts but remain unable to pass meaningful changes to their ADU laws. As legislatures consider whether and how to change state laws governing ADUs, we offer 3 key findings for states that want to significantly increase the production. The first is the importance of requiring by right approvals. We think this is best done at the state level for a variety of reasons. Second, limiting localities' ability to impose requirements for owner occupancy and parking is important, but not quite as critical. On parking, this could take the form of an outright ban, as Oregon and Montana have done, or a ban on parking requirements for ADUs near transit and strict limits on parking requirements in other areas, typically 1 per ADU, which is what California and Washington have done. Some other questions that state policymakers probably have to address are, should detached ADUs be a part of the by right process? Can ADUs be used for short-term rentals? Whether and how to provide financial incentives for permanently affordable ADUs, and how to collect statewide data on ADUs and monitor compliance. Our third key finding is that changing policies in these areas can get others to break the cycle of barriers, namely the lack of homeowner education, financing, and ADU specialized builders. Given this, ADU advocates have to make a strategic decision. When seeking state-level changes, should they pursue a comprehensive or incremental approach? A comprehensive approach goes beyond by right to remove other barriers like occupancy and parking requirements. While it is more likely to produce housing, it may also generate so much opposition that it could imperil any meaningful changes in the way ADUs are regulated. In contrast, a meaningful incremental approach would still require local by right approvals of ADUs, but might not include strong provisions about owner occupancy or parking. While we find this is almost certainly not going to result in the creation of as many ADUs, it might be the only politically feasible way to move forward. To offer some concluding thoughts, changes in state law can lead to significant increases in the production of ADUs. But let's be clear, ADUs alone cannot address the full spectrum of housing challenges. However, they can help alleviate many problems, particularly if they are a part of more comprehensive efforts to provide more affordable, accessible, and sustainable housing. I'll now join in a panel with Jesse Kanson-Benanav, Executive Director of Abundant Housing for Massachusetts, for a discussion moderated by Chris Herbert, the Managing Director of the Center. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks for doing my job as moderator too. So Jesse, you want to come on? Ellie, you want to stop sharing your screen? All right. Well, welcome. Jesse, it's great to have you with us. Let me start by getting you in the conversation. First of all, tell us a bit about Abundant Housing Massachusetts. What's your mission as an organization, and where do ADUs fit in to your work?
Yeah, thanks, Chris and Ellie, for the opportunity to be here today. So yeah, to answer your question, Abundant Housing Massachusetts, we're a statewide pro-housing advocacy organization here, obviously in Massachusetts. Our slogan is that Massachusetts is for everyone, and we believe every community in the state should be open and welcoming to people, regardless of race or income, being primary categories we talk of. But age, ability, national origin, any other identity or life experience. And we're very concerned that that's not the case in many communities across Massachusetts. And we see one of the biggest barriers to that being the existence of exclusionary zoning that allows communities to limit new housing construction in their borders to all but the largest luxury single-family homes. And that has the effect of not just limiting those buildings, but limiting people who would live in those buildings, and results in increased segregation throughout a region. Massachusetts is more segregated today than it was 30 years ago. We also believe that the existence of exclusionary zoning really drives what we have as a major housing crisis or housing shortage here in Massachusetts. We're hundreds of thousands of homes short of where we need to be to give homes to all current and future Massachusetts residents. So we're working to overcome the power of exclusionary zoning. We work in communities around Eastern Massachusetts and around the state to build up a base of grassroots pro-housing organizers. And we do also focus on recognizing that it is state law that gives communities the power to adopt these more exclusionary zoning schemes. And so we have a focus additionally on making sure we modify state law to pull down the barriers of exclusionary zoning. One of the things that we're working on to that end, on the policy end, on the state policy end, is a bill we have called an Act to Promote Yes in My Backyard. And it's a comprehensive zoning reform bill that touches on our need to rezone throughout Massachusetts so we can build more homes. And it does that on a number of fronts. One key element of our bill, and Ellie referenced it in her presentation, is statewide by right legalization of accessory dwelling units, more in the vein of what California or Oregon or maybe Vermont have done in recent years. And so, I think key for us is making sure that there is consistent rules for accessory dwelling units that address or that apply to every community in Massachusetts, 351 cities and towns. One intricacy of the way the Zoning Act works in Massachusetts, it doesn't technically apply to the city of Boston. So our bill would apply to 350 cities and towns, but there is a lot of work going on within the city of Boston to modify their ADU bylaw as well. And we've actually been working with them behind the scenes.
And just to piggyback on Jesse's points there, I think Massachusetts is finding itself at a really interesting and potentially helpful position. While it's late to adopt state law relative to a lot of its neighbors, there's also better potential to really learn from what's been done in other places nearby. So it's up to folks like Jesse and his colleagues to really implement some of those lessons, and they have been doing good work in making meaningful progress on that front.
We're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A. Appreciate that. We'll get to as many as we can. One question I think it's important to clarify. You've been using the expression by right. Can Jesse and Ellie, can you help people understand what does it mean for something to be by right?
Sure, I can speak to that on the local level. And as Jesse mentioned, a lot of these authorities are granted at the state level. So in a place like Massachusetts, unless it's explicitly prohibitive that a city can't do by right, they or cannot do conditional use or special permits, they have the option to do by right. So what by right permitting is, it's also called ministerial in places, administrative permitting, or as of right permitting. And what that allows for is those standards are set in advance and included in the zoning ordinance, that a city official then has the authority to simply review the projects on the merits of does it meet these standards or not. In other places, that might include, only requiring a building permit. So we see both of those examples play out in practice, but that's essentially what by right means at the local level. And our paper argues that that is the most important change to get meaningful production of ADUs.
So if I could try to put that into maybe simple language, it means that if I want to build an ADU, I go in, I file my paperwork. If my proposal meets the specifications in terms of size and the like, it gets reviewed by some official who then says, yes, it's good, but I don't have to go through a zoning board of appeals, a planning board hearing. I don't have to go through open it up to commentary by my neighbors. It's just, if you meet the criteria, you can do it.
Yeah, that's correct. And a lot of my technical explanation comes from my personal background as a planner in North Carolina, where we did actually implement ADU laws. And in hindsight, we included a lot of these more restrictive provisions, but it also helped us pass it at the local level. So that's correct. The benefit of a by right process is that you do not have to go before a planning board or city council. Another thing that's really restrictive to ADUs and sometimes unique to that type of housing is additional design standards and review. Some states have taken very aggressive and meaningful action on this, including Montana, going as far as to say municipalities cannot require a certain pitch in the roof and other design elements to make the ADU look more like the main house. But they're, I think, one of the first places to do that.
Yeah, so you have anything you want to add on that, the by right, and importance of that?
Well, I mean, I think it's critical. I think we have a situation right now in Massachusetts where, after the Housing Choice Act of 2021 that Ellie alluded to, that allows municipalities to adopt ADU bylaws by a simple majority, we see just a patchwork of ADU bylaws, and most of them aren't by right, and most of them have not produced significant, or in some cases any, ADUs. And so I think Ellie's description was right on key, and I think that's critical. By right approval of accessory dwelling units in every municipality of the state is absolutely what we need to aim for here in Massachusetts.
So I want to dig into a couple more specifics here. So Ellie, you identified the by right, the owner occupancy requirement, parking. One of the Q&A questions, a fellow from New Hampshire talking about their recognition that the importance of allowing detached units. And so did you consider whether or not there ought to be a requirement to allow detached units, or how does that fit in? Because that seems like it could be an important piece as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. And thank you for the person joining from New Hampshire that asked that good question. In terms of whether or not to allow detached ADUs, whether at a local level or a state level, we lump it into as sort of a secondary consideration. The big three, as you mentioned, being by right, owner occupancy, and parking. However, detached ADU on a per square foot basis can be more cost effective to build. They do offer additional costs in terms of maybe on-site utility lines or water, sewer, septic capacities, but generally they also open up the possibility for pre-manufactured specs or units that could be placed on site more cost effectively, which is a strategy done by one of New England's builders, backyard ADUs, where they do as much as they can, offsite and preparing it to go on site. And a lot of their more standard models are only detached ADUs. So I would argue that detached ADUs are of great importance when considering these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ellie and I are very much in sync here. I think the detached is really important. The bill we proposed is somewhat agnostic on that. It really sets sort of like dimensional standards that municipalities need to meet, and they could be met by detached or attached ADUs. But I'm hopeful that detached ADUs will become an important part of the strategy in Massachusetts.
The other element, one of the folks in the Q&A was pointing to, several folks actually, was talking about the idea that this is a type of housing that can allow for multi-generational living, for older folks, for special needs family members or community members. But the question then becomes, should universal design features be mandated? Is that an issue that's come up in terms of the other kind of elements that a state might consider in its laws?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Chris. And anecdotally, nearly every homeowner that I spoke to that's an ADU owner that I interviewed for this project, along with David, did in fact have multi-generational living on site. Many cases, it was the parent who had sold their property elsewhere and then used a lot of that capital to go in and be the equity to build the ADUs. And I agree, we didn't dig as much into research on that front, but as a type of housing, that is one of the benefits that ADUs offer. And as we allude to in the presentation, they can have flexibility across the lifespan. So while there may be an aging parent in there for a portion of the time, the ADU could be converted back into a home office or then become rented out on a long-term basis after the need for the immediate family member.
All these kind of wrinkles that I'm getting into does get to the point of, there's a reason why we have deferred to localities to specify zoning regulations, that there's a lot of unique conditions in terms of the existing stock and the like. And so one of the pushbacks that people have against this, then the state taking a strong hand, is the fact that there are these questions that are important that ultimately that localities may be in a better position to address. Jesse, let me ask you, what's your response to that question? I mean, what is the balance between the state looking at the broader interests of the Commonwealth and the need for housing versus localities' expertise really in saying what's right for our community, given our housing stock and the like? How do we balance those things?
Yeah, well, I would say really that for generations now in Massachusetts, going back hundreds of years, we've really prioritized local control, local decision making. We still have the town meeting form of government, where in some cases any registered voter in town can show up at the high school and vote on legislation or bylaws for that year. So that's something that's really hard to break out of culturally here in Massachusetts, and I know in some other New England states. But I think that unfortunately that real dependence or belief in local control has also been what's gotten us into the position where we have such an extreme housing shortage, to the degree of hundreds of thousands of homes, that has made it so that our housing markets, particularly in Greater Boston, are among the most expensive in the nation, and that the responsibility for building the homes that current and future Massachusetts residents need is falling on just a few communities that are doing a bulk of that new construction. And so, I think it's time for us to do some soul searching in Massachusetts about really what are we getting out of local control, in particularly in the area of zoning that limits housing production. And while maybe local control is okay in some policy areas, I would posit that our housing crisis driven by this shortage is because we have given too much power. The state has given too much power to communities and is fearful of preempting local decision making. But as we have seen from other states, that is what we absolutely need to do. So, I'm a big advocate of the state taking more control away from the municipalities on the area of zoning. I'm in great agreement with the Boston Globe editorial board, which just 2 or 3 days ago, had a real fantastic op-ed on this very topic. I think we really need to re-examine what power we give to communities.
Just to echo on Jesse's great points there, I think the one element in our paper is we need to not just allow, but we have to incentivize production. And having more uniformity across jurisdictions creates a standardization in the market that then allows builders to come in and develop products that can actually build the ADUs or make them more affordable to build. And it also gives banks, particularly regional banks, which at this time are taking on a lot of the more progressive ADU type loans, to begin to see the benefits of developing financial products to make ADUs more accessible, and actually seeing that there's very little risk in financing them. So it has to go beyond simply, does zoning allow or not allow this in one place or the other, to being more of a wholesale approach, as we define it, an ecosystem of sorts that gets advocates out there, gets builders out there, and gets banks really recognizing the benefits of ADUs and implementing it.
On this theme again too of the kind of the local control, I guess, or the details of the legislations, we're getting a series of questions too. People are asking about, well, what about size minimums or maximums, setback requirements, height issues, design elements? Are state legislations speaking to that, or are they silent? Is that left to the localities? How do those become critical impediments then? Jesse, I don't know if you have, are there any of the proposals that have been floated from Massachusetts? How are those things dealt with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can mostly speak about our bill, and though there are a few other bills that address ADUs currently in the current legislative session. Yeah, we set some minimum dimensional standards, but basically say that the ADU, setbacks, things like that can't be any different than what would otherwise be allowed on the property for the single family home. We do say that in terms of square footage, an ADU is no more than half the size of the primary dwelling unit, or 900 square feet, I believe, whichever is larger. But we do try to be very descriptive on some fronts, dimensional requirements, so that there is consistency across municipalities and not leaving that up to local decision making. There are some areas that we have allowed, we will leave up to local decision making. We do say in ours that municipalities may allow up to one parking space per ADU, additional off-street parking space per ADU. Very hopeful that some communities, particularly those with stronger transit access, will not require parking minimums in ADUs, and some other areas. But generally, in terms of like design standards, historic preservation, other things, we say that the ADU, those things we can't have additional, for instance, design standards applied to the ADU that would not be applied to a single family home in the same district.
Yeah, just a couple on Jesse there. I mean, the mission of any state law should be to be as unambiguous as possible, because localities, where a lot of, there's a lot more local politics, their local councilors are more inclined to listen to homeowners. They're inclined to find maybe creative ways to get around some of the state laws. And that is seen in an example like Connecticut, where 2/3 of the localities have opted out of state law and adopted, in many instances, creative but more restrictive provisions. And so states really need to be thinking about how the localities are going to be interpreting this law when setting minimum and maximum thresholds. And there are examples in Massachusetts where jurisdictions have said for a typical, I think I'm getting an echo there.
You're good.
Okay.
You're good on
Our jurisdictions have said for a typical 10,000 square foot lot for a single family home, for example, that you actually need 20% more in order to build an ADU. So now you need let's say a 12,000 square foot lot to put an ADU there. So it's very critical that states anticipate and draft the law to be unambiguous.
I know this goes a little bit beyond what your work, Ellie, but an important part of the conversation is, who's this housing for? And I think there's a hope that it provides a more affordable a housing option for folks. Can either of you speak to the question of how affordable is this housing, and what would it take to make it more affordable?
I'll start with this if that's okay, Jesse. Cole Peterson has done some work on this and in Portland. He's a well-known ADU advocate and expert, and has made some interesting remarks. I mean, as the presentation notes, there is a high cost to construct ADUs. And unless there are enough incentives provided by, say, banks or localities to get homeowners to do it, it is a costly endeavor. However, my looking into this has found that ADUs still serve as a form of naturally occurring affordable housing, typically because their occupants are either friends of or family members or an aging parent, to where you could have that additional unit of housing and house a person that might be paying significantly below market rents relative to maybe a one bedroom in the same market. So they're, thinking of non-subsidized housing here. They hold strong potential to be a form of naturally occurring affordable housing. That being said, the current landscape is that only people with a lot of equity or equity in their home or personal capital and savings can get through the hurdle to build them in the first place. And that is why there's interesting work being done, in Salem and Barnstable that offers particular incentives to make them long, term or 12-month lease or affordable housing capped at a certain area median income. So I think we will start to see ADUs beginning to shift as, more regulated, affordable, so to speak. We're seeing that on the West Coast and in a few notable cases here on the East Coast. The problem is that to build them, you need, a lot of equity or capital upfront.
Yeah, I would, certainly agree with everything Ellie said, and I do think the case of Salem and Barnstable, provides some interesting examples as we consider this more broadly in Massachusetts. I think one point I would like to make is that in order to, meet the demands of the housing shortage crisis we have in Massachusetts, we need to build a variety of homes at all income levels. And we need to figure out how to make market rate housing, whether ADUs or any other type of housing, more moderately priced so that people who may not be income eligible for subsidized housing, but can't afford, a high-end market rent, can still afford to live in our cities and our state. And I think that ADUs, because of, everything that Ellie has shown in this research, have, provide an important strategy for that. Obviously, as she said, it's not the solution in and of itself, so we're considering other priorities, other approaches in Massachusetts. We have this MBTA Communities Act that requires multifamily zoning as of right near transit. We're proposing other things in our act to promote Yes in My Backyard for things like commercial to residential conversions. They're all part of the same puzzle, but ADUs can be a really important way to bring some more moderately priced sort of quote unquote market housing to more communities and more residents across the state.
Yeah, and just to add a quick footnote to this discussion, the scope of what we're talking about here in the presentation is, legally permitted ADUs. ADUs have a very interesting history of as unpermitted structures that offer housing options to many different types of communities, and culturally that also expands beyond the United States. So part of the reason why LA in particular and California has seen such a drastic increase is because LA has created more pathways for legalization of formerly unpermitted ADU permits. And that comes down to, not just the state, but really localities. Portland has taken a similar approach of being a little bit less, being maybe more lenient or offering more opportunities for folks that might have an existing unpermitted, not up to code ADU, and help bringing that in to a code. And it goes back to your earlier point of, Chris, how do we create maybe more accessible ADUs for folks of a certain age or need? And one of the pictures in the slide shows a fully accessible ADU built in Portland, Oregon for that reason. And it's all the countertops have been customized so that person can utilize it in a wheelchair. So, but it takes the market getting to a certain point before those possibilities even can happen. And that's why I go back to Massachusetts is in a really interesting and unique place to be thinking ahead on a lot of these things.
Yeah, I want to, I think this is a really important point in relative to Abundant Housing Massachusetts' role too, to say, and maybe I'll end in the form of a question, but I'll start in the form of a statement. You know, a lot of times I've been involved in my local town in conversations about allowing greater density to one of those higher end suburbs, and the single family house gets built nowadays, new 3 million, 4 million. There's been pushed to allow for duplexes. Duplexes get built and they're both selling for 1.2 million. And people say, what did we accomplish? That's not affordable. But I'll put it in the form of a question. So Jesse, what's your answer to that question about, you know, even if these ADUs are, you know, they're big, $300,000, $400,000 to build, they're not affordable. Is it helping in any way?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly are helping. You know, the situation we have in Massachusetts is that because we have such an extreme housing shortage, we're pitting people across the income spectrum against each other in the competition for housing. So, you know, many longtime residents in communities around the state, many working class or you know, moderate income families and households are having to compete with wealthier residents, often, you know, also longtime residents, sometimes newcomers, but they're competing against each other for that very limited supply of housing. In that competition, the wealthier folks are always going to be the one that win because they can bid up the cost of housing. And so that's what is causing, you know, displacement of working class communities around our state and particularly in and around our cities. And so providing housing opportunities for everyone, including folks that can, you know, afford to rent what was built as a $500,000 or $600,000 accessory dwelling unit, is important because it takes them out of that competition and might leave some of the existing housing stock open for other families that may not be able to afford, you know, the more highly priced housing. So I think it's really important. Again, it's about building housing for everyone, a variety of housing types and a variety of income levels. And ADUs, regardless of how much they ultimately cost to who lives in them, can be an important part of that conversation. But again, I do think they can be also a naturally occurring, affordable part of the conversation.
It's a really interesting dialogue and debate here, because when you take, you know, Chris, like a place like what you're describing, where they're hesitant to do 3 to 4 units on a parcel, well, suddenly at the local level, ADUs can become the compromise. And if they can go really hard, like with ADUs, there is potential for them to meaningfully impact. So my answer to your question would be, and you might be happy to hear this, supply, supply, supply. If ADUs are now the incremental compromised thing that can be passed at the local level, there is potential for them. I mean, we see that Portland, when they make 15% of permits issued or all housing units since 2010, and California's 18, even a place with 30,000 residents, Dover, ADUs are now 8% of their housing permits since 2010. That is a significant enough number to make an impact.
That's great. One other theme that's come up a bit in the Q&A are people's questions about to what extent are these being used for Airbnb? You know, if we're generating this housing and it's not really going to house people, but going just as, you know, income producing property to, you know, build that market, and maybe potentially too, if you don't have an owner occupancy requirement, now you can have 2 units being Airbnb. What's the what do we know about the prevalence of Airbnb, and is that a concern?
Go ahead. You can go first.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, please.
What I would say is first, sort of on a maybe broader philosophical level, that if we reached a level of housing abundance in Massachusetts, the existence of Airbnbs would not be as devastating to the housing market in terms of taking permanent rental units off the market. Of course, we're not in a state of housing abundance. And so Airbnbs or other short-term rentals do have that impact. So hopefully we can get to a point in the future where we have enough homes and a large enough vacancy rate that Airbnbs or other short-term rentals aren't doing that. But that's not where we are right now. Under our bill, we do give municipalities the right to ban the use of ADUs for short-term rentals. I think, I'll be interested to hear from Ellie if she has data on how many or how often ADUs are used for short-term rentals, and certainly that maybe is more acute in places like Cape Cod. We recognize that's a grave concern, and it could be a barrier to towns accepting this essentially, and so we've allowed that under our bill.
Yeah, that's a great point. My only thoughts that I would add is I would personally say that you need to separate short-term rental debates distinctly from the ADUs only. If your municipality is struggling with the prevalence of short-term rentals or Airbnbs, ADUs should be no exceptions to other forms of housing. If single-family homes or duplexes have the right to use for short-term rentals, but now ADUs don't, that they should not be treated any differently. So I would argue that a place needs to, and it may help politically pass at the local level, to separate the current debate of short-term rentals from that of ADUs. If you want to have a short-term rental ban, it should apply to all types of housing. And that's an argument that the AARP outlines in its recent 2020 model. Research that I've looked at says even if that is the case, majority of ADUs are still used for long-term housing. Anywhere between 30% might be a short-term rental in a high tourist market. But for places like you mentioned on the Cape, like Barnstable, one creative strategy is to say, short-term rental, separate issue. But if you use ADU for long-term housing or a 12-month lease, then we'll offer you loans, we'll give you incentives, we'll do all these things to help, combat issues of limited supply of longer-term lease housing in vacation areas.
We're getting near the end here. There was a series of questions around the role of Fannie Freddie, the GSEs, and lending. This might be a bit beyond what you studied, Ellie or Jesse. I don't know if you've gotten into this. My sense would be that it would be difficult to get a conventional loan to pay for the construction of a new unit. You might be able to get a loan for if you want to do a rehabbed house, but there's going to be very conservative in terms of what the value would be. If you're talking about an existing ADU, it could be underwritten as a two-family house where you'd have to prove the rental stream. But so it seems like there's probably options, but they may be difficult. But Jesse or Ellie, how familiar are you with the conventional lending opportunities for ADUs?
So the presentation alludes to this when we say that ADUs are suddenly a part of the national dialogue. The White House and executive branch are now putting out studies on this, and Fannie and Freddie are also beginning to study ADUs. They have a recent publication on how to expand loan options, what ADUs are, that I encourage everyone on this call to look at because it's very informative. That being said, like you mentioned, Chris, I think that it's more likely and easier for GSEs to come in and say, okay, we're going to expand ADUs for maybe construction loan options, not just, HELOC, for example. The problem is that places on the West Coast, like that data I showed you, where 63% of people used their own savings and 40-something% used leveraging their equity in their home. Only 7% of people financed an ADU with a construction loan. So many researchers on the West Coast are now saying construction loans, expansion of construction loan products specific to ADUs, are the pathway forward. National banks like Bank of America is much more hesitant to do loans for ADUs because there's just too much risk across too many markets. So that's why we're seeing a lot more regional banks step up into this space, because they can better understand the local laws and de-risk their investments. So it's really going to take more and more uniform state laws for, in my opinion, entities like Fannie and Freddie to pay attention and change their policies.
Wonderful. Well, we're right at the end here. Jesse, let me close by asking you a question about the prognosis for ADU legislation in the state of Massachusetts. What's your prognosis for getting something passed?
I feel very positive about it, as Ellie alluded to in her presentation, or not alluded to. She mentioned we got really close last year with an ADU portion included in the Senate version of economic development bill that ultimately got messed up by a whole other conversation around tax relief in Massachusetts, and so was pulled from that bill. But we got close. Our bill has about 20% of the legislature, both the House and Senate, signed on as co-sponsors, which is pretty significant for bills in Massachusetts. Really, as we're talking, I know that the Healy administration is working on finalizing our housing bond bill, which really focuses a lot on the capital side of funding housing programs in Massachusetts, but they have said they will include some important policy provisions. I am hopeful that an ADU provision will be included in that. I think what remains to be seen is whether they are going to take the more comprehensive approach that Ellie writes about and is talking about, or the incremental one. Obviously, I would push strongly for the comprehensive approach that I think we have taken under the Act to Promote Yes in My Backyard. But we'll see, I think, in the coming days. Regardless, I think something statewide with some element of by right is likely going to happen in Massachusetts. So stay tuned to the news over the next week or so, because I think it's an exciting time.
And Jesse, on that point, assuming it's successful, I was having dinner with a fellow last night who was trying to get an ADU in his backyard for his son with special needs. And he's saying, how long till I can, be in a position where I can get that? So if the state passes a law, how long till a locality will be able have to say yes in my backyard? Literally.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on whether we take the approach of passing it through the housing bond bill or passing it through our standalone bill. I think I don't actually know in the case of the housing bond bill what that would do, but I think ours sets basically as soon as it is signed into law, the state the Executive Office of Housing Livable Communities would have to write some guidelines for the implementation. That could take some time, but I would say within 6 to 12 months, it would actually be in place. Hopefully shorter than that. That's an estimate based on how I've seen other guideline writings going, but sooner than later.
Good. Well, that's great news. Ellie, let me close with you. It's a great piece of work. Kudos to you and to David, who I know helped you quite a bit as well. Any last words, or maybe as you go through this project, was there any big ahas or epiphanies or things that surprised you?
I would say one of my aha moments that Dave and I were laughing about last night came this week when, as we said in the presentation, zoning is both the pathway and the barrier to ADUs. So it's really first and foremost going to come down to how we can improve our zoning. But it's been such a pleasure working on this project, especially having helped adopt and implement these laws at a local level and practice before coming to grad school, and now in hindsight, assessing these impacts and barriers. So it's been great working with you all, and I look forward to you all reading the paper and giving me tons of helpful feedback.
Great. Well, I violated David's rule of not ending on time. I went over a little bit, but I think it's been a great conversation. It's great work. I'm really hopeful that that we will see progress in Massachusetts, because while it may seem like a niche housing type, as you say, in places where it's 15 to 18% of new housing, that's meaningful. And so, so thank you, Ellie. Thank you for your work. Jesse, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for your work at Abundant Housing Massachusetts. And thanks to you all for tuning in. Hope to see you next time. So be well. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.